Imagine a civilization, so skilled, they carved their actual homes right into mountainsides, but then, poof, vanished, almost without a trace.
It's a powerful image, isn't it?
It really is. We're diving into that story today, the story of Prophet Saleh and the ancient people of Thamud. It's a narrative you find woven through the Quran, but it also seems to echo in historical records and even archaeological digs.
And what's really compelling, I think, is that you can't just look at it from one angle. You've got the Qur'anic account, sure, but then there are these historical mentions. Assyrian, Babylonian,
Right.
Greco-Roman writers talk about them. And then there's the archaeology, especially at Hegra or Mada Saleh, plus inscriptions, myths from around the world, even geology and linguistics. It all adds up.
Exactly. It's like putting together a puzzle, and that's what we're trying to do in this deep dive, sort of give you a shortcut to getting a handle on Nabi Saleh and the Thamud.
We've looked at a whole range of things.
Yeah, Quranic versus interpretations, those historical accounts you mentioned from Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, the finds at Hegra, those Thamudic and Nabatean rock writings.
And even bringing in some science, like geology.
Right. So our mission, if you like, is to first really unpack the Quranic story of Nabi Saleh. Second, explore the historical and archaeological backdrop. And third, maybe think about what it all means in a broader sense.
Sounds like a plan. Where should we start?
Okay, let's begin with the core source.
Yeah.
The Quran itself. It's pretty striking just how often Nabi Saleh and the Thamud pop up. Al-Araf, Hud, Al-Hur, Al-Shawara,
Nam, Fusalat, Zariyat.
Al-Qamar, Al-Haqqa, Al-Fajr, Ash-Shams.
It's a lot.
It really is, and that repetition isn't accidental. It underlines just how theologically significant their story is considered within Islam.
It's not just a footnote.
Not at all. It's presented as a key lesson, a recurring pattern almost, about civilization's guidance and, well, the consequences of rejecting that guidance. And the core message from Nabi Saleh seems crystal clear, right? Worship Allah alone. Turn away from the idols they had. Seek forgiveness. Repent. Simple. Direct.
Very direct. And it's significant he's called their brother in the Quran.
Yeah, what's the importance of that?
Well, it suggests he wasn't an outsider. He was one of them, knew their ways, their culture.
So they couldn't just dismiss him as some foreigner who didn't understand them.
Precisely. It makes their rejection feel more deliberate, more personal somehow.
Now, the Quran paints a picture of the Thamud, successors to another group, the Ada, who also faced destruction.
Right, there's a sequence there.
And these Thamud, they were blessed. Prosperity, incredible physical strength, and these amazing building skills carving mountains into homes and palaces. It sounds almost mythical.
It does, but the Quran links that material success directly to their downfall.
How so?
It suggests that their progress, their wealth, their skills, it led to arrogance, back to idolatry, corruption spreading through their society.
It's kind of a timeless warning, isn't it? About getting lost in material success.
Very much so. The Quran draws a clear line between their skills and their moral slide. It's a theme you see again and again, blessings turning into a source of heedlessness or defiance.
Okay, then comes this huge turning point. The miracle of the she-camel. The Khat Allah, the camel of God.
Ah, yes, the sign.
And it wasn't just any camel. It was like a specific sign they actually demanded as proof of Saleh's prophethood.
They asked for a miracle, and this was it. Reportedly emerged from a rock, which is extraordinary in itself.
Wow. And specific rules came with her.
Yes, very clear conditions. She was to be allowed to graze freely wherever she wanted. And there was a specific arrangement for sharing water, one day for the camel, one day for the people.
So it was a test of obedience, of respecting this divine sign.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about the miracle itself, but how they treated it, how they lived with it. It tested their fairness, their commitment.
And how did that go?
Not well. The Quran describes mockery, accusations they called Saleh bewitched, a liar.
Their arrogance just kept growing.
It seems so. It culminates in this shocking act of defiance.
Yeah.
They kill the she-camel.
Just kill the sign they were given.
Exactly. Some accounts mention specific individuals, sometimes a group of 9 leading the plot. It's presented as blatant, willful disobedience, a direct challenge.
So they crossed the line.
A very clear line. Killing the camel wasn't just harming an animal, it was rejecting the divine sign, throwing the proof back, in a sense.
And what happened next?
Saleh delivered a final, stark warning. They had 3 days. After that, punishment would strike.
3 days. That's specific.
It is, and the Quran uses these incredibly powerful words to describe the punishment, the azab. Arajfa, the earthquake, or trembling. Asayha, the shout, or the blast. Asayka, the thunderbolt. Ataya, the overwhelming calamity.
Wow. Those words paint a picture of total devastation. The trembling, the cry, the thunderbolt.
It's intense, and scholars often suggest these aren't necessarily separate events, but maybe different facets of one single catastrophic, all-encompassing destruction. Total annihilation.
Utterly wiped out.
That's the implication of the terms used, yes.
But amidst all that destruction, the story doesn't end there, does it? There's a mention of salvation, too.
Yes, and that's crucial. The Quran makes it clear that Nabi Saleh and those who had believed in his message, the faithful few, were saved.
An act of divine mercy.
Exactly. It highlights that even in judgment, there's mercy for those who listen and remain steadfast. It draws a sharp line between the guided and the defiant.
Now, shifting gears a bit, it's really interesting to place this story within the wider world of Abrahamic traditions. Because, well, it seems largely absent from the others.
That's a very significant point. When you look at the canonical Hebrew Bible, the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, or the New Testament, you don't find Nabi Saleh or this detailed story of the Thamud and the she-camel.
That's it, stop there.
Right. And this wasn't lost on early Islamic scholars. Al-Tabari, for instance, mentions discussions where some people of the Torah apparently didn't know about Ad or Thamud or the prophets Hud or Saleh, even though these figures were well known in Arabia, almost like Ibrahim.
So this difference was recognized early on.
Yes, it points to early interreligious awareness and dialogue about differing prophetic traditions.
Are there any, maybe, speculative links people have tried to make? Like linguistic connections?
Well, there's the name itself. Aliyah in Arabic means righteous. And in Hebrew you have adik, which also means righteous.
So the meaning is similar.
The meaning is very similar, rooted in the same Semitic concept of righteousness. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the same person. It could just be a shared concept, a shared value. The Quran itself even references the idea of the righteous inheriting the earth, potentially echoing themes found in the Psalms, the Zabur.
Interesting. What about names in the Bible? Is there anything that sounds similar?
There is a name, Selah, or Shalach, mentioned in Genesis.
Selah. They sound alike.
Phonetically, yes. But this Selah in Genesis is listed purely as an ancestor of Abraham in the genealogy. He's not presented as a prophet with a story like Saleh's no mission to a specific people, no rejection, no miraculous camel, no divine punishment narrative.
So probably just a coincidental sound similarity.
That's the general consensus. The narratives are completely different.
There's also a hadith, right?
Mm-hmm.
A saying attributed to Prophet Muhammad that makes a distinction.
Yes, a hadith that distinguishes between prophets associated with Sham, which usually means the Levant area, think biblical prophets, and prophets specifically of Arabia.
And who does it list for Arabia?
It mentions Hud, Shu'aib, Saleh, and Muhammad himself.
So that reinforces the idea of a distinct Arabian prophetic line.
Exactly. It suggests a tradition of prophecy rooted specifically in the Arabian context, whose stories might not be in the scriptures originating further north. The Quran is presented as preserving and highlighting these Arabian narratives.
It's interesting, though, that later on, say in the 19th century, there was more interaction with biblical texts. Translations became more available, this biblical turn in Qur'anic interpretation. Did that change how Saleh was viewed?
While there was certainly increased engagement with biblical material, Saleh largely remained a figure primarily understood through the Quran and Islamic tradition.
He didn't suddenly get mapped onto a biblical figure.
No, not really. Which again reinforces the idea that his story is deeply embedded in Arabian memory and tradition, which the Quran then adopts and gives its specific theological meaning.
So putting it together,
Yeah.
the absence in the Bible, the pre-Islamic Arabian references we know existed, plus historical evidence for a people called Thamud. It all points to this being an Arabian story, rooted in that specific history and culture, which the Quran then elevates and interprets.
That's a very good summary. The Quran frequently takes figures or events known to its audience and reframes them within its universal message of monotheism, prophecy, and accountability.
Okay, let's dig into that historical context more. The name Thamud itself, it shows up in non-Quranic sources for a surprisingly long time, doesn't it?
It really does. We have mentions starting in Syrian records from the 8th century BC.
Well, that's early.
Then Babylonian inscriptions in the 6th century BC. Greco-Roman writers mention them from around the 2nd century BC to the 2nd AD, and even Roman and Byzantine sources refer to them up until about the 5th century AD.
So the name had legs, historically speaking.
Definitely. It signifies a known entity in northwest Arabia for over a millennium. And the Quran placing them chronologically after Ad and before Moses generally fits within this broad time frame of ancient presence.
And geographically, everyone seems to agree. Northwest Arabia, the Hijaz region, specifically around Al-Hijr, which we now often call Madain Salah.
Yes, that location is key. And it wasn't just anywhere, it was right on major ancient trade routes.
Which would have been crucial for their development, trade, exposure to others.
Absolutely. Strategic location often shapes a people's history.
We talked about their skill in carving rock. What else do we know or suspect about their society? They started nomadic, maybe?
Likely starting as nomadic pastoralists, yes, but probably evolving towards being semi-settled, especially in oasis areas like Al-Ula, allowing for some limited agriculture alongside the caravan trade.
And we have inscriptions, right? The Thamudic ones.
Mhm.
What do they tell us?
They're fascinating, often short, graffiti-like sometimes. But they give us personal names, hints of genealogies, prayers, or invocations to their gods indicating polytheism, like the worship of a deity called Wuoth, found at a site called Ruwafa. They also mark ownership, sometimes just simple messages.
So little windows into their world, their language, their beliefs.
Exactly. Direct, though fragmented evidence of their pre-Islamic culture. It clearly shows a polytheistic background, which contrasts sharply with Saleh's monotheistic call in the Quran.
And were they isolated or interacting with others?
Although definitely interacting. With neighbors like the Lichianites based in nearby Dedan, the Nabateans who become so important later, the Kedarites, and they had dealings with the big regional powers too. Assyria, Babylon, eventually Rome.
So part of a complex regional network.
Very much so. Ancient Arabia wasn't empty. It was a tapestry of tribes, kingdoms, and trade routes.
Now, here's a puzzle we touched on. The Quran describes this specific, devastating destruction for the Thamud community connected to Salah. But history keeps mentioning Thamud for centuries after. How do we reconcile that?
That's a critical question. The most likely explanation isn't that the Quran is wrong, but that the term Thamud wasn't static.
Meaning?
It probably referred to different groups over that long span of time. Perhaps the original group associated with the events in the Quran did face a catastrophe or decline, but the name persisted, maybe used for related tribes or people living in the same region, or even just as a broad label used by outsiders.
So the Quran focuses on one specific early iteration of Thamud, the one contemporary with Salah.
That seems the most logical way to read it alongside the historical evidence. It's like how Celt or Viking could refer to various groups across different times and places. The Quranic narrative has a specific focus.
Okay, that makes sense. Which leads us directly to the archaeology, and specifically to Hegra or Madain Salah, a UNESCO World Heritage Site now.
And for good reason. It's an astonishing site. The preservation is incredible.
When you go there or see pictures, what really dominates the landscape?
Undeniably, it's the Nabatean presence. Those spectacular rock-cut tombs, over 111 of them, with ornate facades, they are masterpieces of Nabatean architecture, mostly dating from the 1st century BC to the early 2nd century AD.
So the famous tombs are mostly Nabatean.
Overwhelmingly so. We also find remains of their settlement areas, though less well preserved than the tombs, sophisticated water channels and cisterns, and clear evidence of their religious practices, worship areas, depictions of their main god Dushara, sacred stones, or buttels.
But it wasn't only Nabatean. Was there anything before them?
Yes, there's evidence for earlier activity. We find inscriptions and other scripts like Lichianite and, importantly, Thamudic. There's rock art that seems pre-Nabatean, and remember, nearby sites like Dedan, ancient Lycianite capital, and Koraya show the region was inhabited much earlier.
And you mentioned late Thamudic inscription.
Right. There's a fascinating Nabatean tomb inscription dated to 267 AD that includes a gloss or note written in Thamudic script. It tells us that Thamudic writing, and perhaps some sense of Thamudic identity, persisted well into the Nabatean and even post-Nabatean Roman period.
Okay, so how does all this archaeology connect back to the Quranic story?
Well, the most obvious connection is the theme of carving dwellings and tombs into the mountains. The Quran emphasizes the skill of the Thamud, and Hegra is perhaps the most spectacular example of that kind of architecture in Arabia.
Even if the main monuments are Nabatean.
Even so. And the Quran specifically mentions the Ashab al-Hijr, the companions or people of al-Hijr, which is the ancient name for Hegra, so there's a direct geographical link in the text.
But then we hit that tension again. The Quran talks about a sudden divine destruction. Archaeology at Hegra suggests something different for the Nabatean city, right?
Correct. The archaeology of Nabatean Hegra points towards a gradual decline, particularly after the Roman Empire annexed the Nabatean kingdom in 106 AD. Trade routes shifted away from Hegra, and the city slowly faded. There isn't clear archaeological evidence at Hegra for a sudden, catastrophic event described in the Qur'anic narrative concerning the Thamud.
So we have this strong Islamic tradition linking Hegra to the Thamud of the Quran, but the most visible archaeology is Nabatean, and the end story looks different. How do people try to bridge that gap?
There are a few possibilities people explore. One, maybe there are earlier Thamudic layers at Hegra that just haven't been extensively excavated yet. Possible, but not yet demonstrated. Two, perhaps the Quran is referring more broadly to the region known for this type of rock carving, a skill associated with Thamudic peoples, even if the Nabateans perfected it later at Hegra. Three, maybe later Islamic tradition conflated the Quranic story of the Thamud with the impressive Nabatean ruins they saw at Hegra.
Or maybe the Nabateans were seen as successors or inheritors in some way.
That's another angle. Perhaps some Thamudic elements were absorbed by the Nabateans, but based purely on the monumental archaeology visible today, it's predominantly Nabatean. The connection to the Qur'anic Thamud is strong in tradition, but archaeologically complex.
What's undeniable, though, is that Hegra, with all those different scripts found there, Thamudic, Lahianite, Nabatean, Greek, Latin, was a real crossroads.
Absolutely, a melting pot of cultures and languages, situated on vital trade routes for centuries.
It feels helpful to maybe summarize the correlations and tensions.
Good idea. So correlations. Quran mentions Thamud in northwest Arabia. Hegra is there. Quran mentions carving mountains. Hegra has spectacular examples. Quran mentions Ashav al-Hijr, tensions. Quranic timeline, likely much earlier than Hegra's Nabatean peak. Quran describes specific polytheism rejected by Saleh. Hegra shows Nabatean polytheism, and earlier inscriptions show other pre-Islamic deities. Quran describes sudden divine destruction, archaeology suggests gradual decline for Nabatean Hegra, and the she-camel miracle remains unique to the Quranic narrative.
Okay, that clarifies the complexities. Now let's look at the story from another angle, comparative mythology. Does the story of Saleh and Thamud echo themes found in other world myths?
Oh, definitely. Looking at it comparatively helps us see universal patterns in storytelling about humanity, the divine, morality, and catastrophe.
So what are the key beats in the Saleh story that we can look for elsewhere?
Well, you have the rejected divine messenger or prophet, the demand for and granting of a miraculous sign. Then, crucially, the violation of that sacred sign or ignoring the warning that came with it, a specific warning period before disaster strikes, the divine punishment or destruction itself. And maybe that motif of life coming from Stone the she-camel emerging from the rock.
Okay, where do we see parallels?
Loads of places. Think about the ancient Near East, Mesopotamia, Egypt. Flood myths are almost universal, right? Noah in the Bible, Utnapishtim and Gilgamesh. Divine anger causing disaster.
Creation and destruction cycles, too.
Exactly. Animal symbolism is huge in many mythologies. Even specific elements, like the 3 days of darkness during the 10 plagues in Egypt, resonate with the 3-day warning given to the Thamud.
What about Greece and Rome?
Similar themes. Gods getting angry Zeus, Hera, prophets whose warnings are ignored like Cassandra, stories of lost civilizations, Atlantis being the most famous, miracles like healing associated with Asclepius.
And even within the Bible, beyond Noah.
Sure, as narrative motifs.
Yeah.
Moses striking the rock to get water life from stone, in a sense. The miracles of prophets like Elijah and Elisha. The famous destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness. Similar structures, even if the details differ.
And outside the Abrahamic Greco-Roman sphere.
Absolutely. Creation myths, flood stories, destruction myths like the Unu Pachacudi flood cycle in Andean traditions. You find these patterns globally. It suggests these are fundamental ways humans have tried to understand their place in the world, the nature of power, and the consequences of actions.
So the Saleh story, while unique in its specifics, the Arabian setting, the she-camel, its basic plot structure resonates widely.
Precisely. It taps into these deep, recurring patterns in human storytelling about the relationship between the divine, morality, power, and catastrophe.
That specific element of destruction by a loud cry, or thunderbolt, esaika, that feels very dramatic. Are there parallels to that specific type of destruction?
Yes, the idea of a powerful destructive sound or voice is also found elsewhere. Think of the divine voice or word in creation stories, but also in destruction, war cries of gods, even the story of the walls of Jericho falling to sound in the Bible. It associates sound with immense, potentially world-altering power.
And you mentioned before it could possibly link to natural phenomena.
It's conceivable. In a seismically active region, the sounds accompanying major earthquakes or even volcanic activity could be terrifyingly loud and destructive, providing a potential naturalistic echo for such descriptions, without discounting the theological meaning, of course.
And that 3-day warning period keeps popping up.
It does. 3 days of darkness in Egypt, 3 days features in some end times prophecies in different traditions. It often seems to signify a final countdown, a last chance before an inevitable event. The number 3 itself often carries symbolic weight in mythology.
So after the destruction, what happened? Did any Thamud survive? Are there descendants?
Well, Islamic tradition, as we said, speaks of the salvation of Nabi Saleh and the believers. Some traditions say they migrated maybe towards Mecca or perhaps to Ramla in Palestine. There are sites associated with Saleh in the Levant.
Well, what about the Thamud as a people? Didn't Arab genealogists have a specific category for them?
They did. Classical Arab genealogists classified both Ad and Thamud as al-Arab al-Baida, the lost or vanished Arabs.
Vanished Arabs. That sounds pretty final.
It implies they disappeared as a distinct, cohesive tribal entity, differentiating them from later groups like the Qadanites and Adnanites, who formed the main branches of subsequent Arab lineage. So, genealogically, they were seen as having come to an end either through destruction or assimilation.
But again, we have that tension with the historical records mentioning Thamud much later.
Right. So, vanished genealogically as a major, distinct founding group, perhaps, but the name clearly continued to be used, likely for remnant populations, related tribes in the area, or just as a regional or external label. The historical persistence of the name suggests it wasn't an absolute, instantaneous wipeout of everyone ever associated with the term.
Have people tried to link them to later known groups, like the Nabateans?
The Nabatean connection is often discussed, but it's complex. Some ancient sources might hint at a relationship, maybe successors, maybe absorption of some Thamudic elements, but they are generally treated as distinct, and the chronology is tricky, with Nabatean Hegra flourishing long after the likely Qur'anic timeframe for Saleh. It was probably a mix of interaction, succession, maybe some assimilation over time.
Any other groups? What about the Bani Thaqif tribe?
There's a popular tradition linking the Bani Thaqif, the tribe based in Taif, to remnants of the Thamud. However, historians generally view this connection as having a weak historical basis, likely more legendary or based on later attempts to create prestigious ancient lineages.
So tracing a direct line is really difficult.
Extremely difficult. Over millennia, with fragmented records, tribal movements, name changes, it's virtually impossible to draw a firm, unbroken line of descent without strong genetic or continuous textual proof, which we don't really have.
So what's the most likely scenario for any survivors?
Assimilation seems the most plausible fate for any surviving Thamudic populations. They would likely have been absorbed into other, larger Arab tribal confederations that rose to prominence in the region over the centuries.
It reminds us that identity in ancient Arabia was probably quite fluid.
Exactly. We shouldn't think in terms of rigid, unchanging ethnic boxes. It was a dynamic environment of shifting alliances, tribal movements, absorption, and reformation of identities. Trying to impose simple linear descent models is probably misleading.
Okay, let's bring in some of those scientific perspectives we mentioned earlier. Geology, linguistics, environment. How do they add to the picture?
They provide really valuable context, grounding the narrative in the physical realities of the region.
So, geology first. We know the area is famous for sandstone.
Yes, the massive sandstone formations, geologists call them things like the Quawira or Sick formations, absolutely dominate the landscape around Hegra and Alula. This specific geology is precisely why rock-cut architecture was feasible and became so prominent there. It's relatively easy to carve compared to harder rocks like granite.
And you also mentioned volcanic rock nearby, basalt.
Right, there are large basaltic plateaus known as Herat, not far away, so
Yeah.
it's a varied geological landscape.
And what about natural processes affecting the ruins today?
Well, the desert climate is harsh. Wind erosion carrying sand blasts the rock faces. Salt weathering, where salt crystals grow in pores and crack the rock, is significant. You see honeycomb weathering, exfoliation, where layers peel off, cracking due to temperature changes. All these natural processes contribute to how the ruins look today, offering a scientific perspective on their condition alongside any theological interpretations of destruction or decay.
And the earthquake risk.
Yes, the region is tectonically active. It sits relatively near the Red Sea Rift System and the major Dead Sea Transform Fault. There is a history of seismic activity, People might remember the Gulf of Aqaba earthquake in 1995,
Yeah.
and those basaltic volcanic fields nearby, like Har Rahat and Har Lunir, are Cenozoic, meaning geologically recent activity. So the area is definitely susceptible to earthquakes and related phenomena like ground shaking or fissures.
So geology provides a plausible natural context for some elements of the destruction story, like the trembling or Rajfa.
It provides a scientifically plausible context, yes. It shows the region is prone to such events. Science doesn't prove the cause described in the Quran, but it confirms the potential for similar natural disasters in that specific location.
Okay, what about linguistics? The Thamudic script and language.
Right, so Thamud isn't one single script, but an umbrella term. It belongs to the ancient North Arabian ANA family of alphabets, related to but distinct from ancient South Arabian, used in Yemen, and also distinct from the Nabatean Aramaic script.
And different tribes use these Thamudic scripts.
Exactly. It was used by various groups across a wide area of North and Central Arabia for centuries, not just the specific people called Thamud in the historical records or the Quran. Think of it like different groups using variants of the Latin alphabet today.
And the language itself.
The language recorded in these scripts belongs to the North Arabian language group. Its exact relationship to later classical Arabic is complex and still studied by linguists. Some dialects have interesting features, like Thamudic C, using H for the definite article instead of all.
And what do the inscriptions actually say?
Mostly quite brief things. Lots of personal names, sometimes short genealogies, X son of Y. Prayers or invocations to deities, confirming their polytheistic background. Ownership marks on property or camels. Simple graffiti like X was here. Some texts are longer but harder to interpret.
So they give us direct, if limited, glimpses into their world.
Exactly. Names, tribal affiliations, religious expressions, everyday concerns. They're invaluable primary sources for understanding pre-Islamic North Arabia.
And finally, the environment back then. Was it different?
There's evidence suggesting the Arabian Peninsula was generally wetter and greener further back in the past. Maybe during the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, you see these large, now dry, river valleys, wadis. But the trend for the last few millennia has been towards increasing aridity, the desert conditions we see today.
So oases like Aula would have been vital.
Absolutely crucial for any settled life for agriculture. Water was and is the key resource. And one other huge environmental factor was the domestication of the camel.
When did that happen?
It became widespread likely in the late 2nd or early 1st millennium BC. This revolutionized life in Arabia. It allowed for long-distance caravan trade across arid regions, connecting Arabia to the wider Near East and enabling nomadic groups to exploit the deep desert. The Thamud story unfolds within this camel-centric desert culture.
Okay, so bringing all these threads together, Quran, history, archaeology, myths, science, it really demands a multidisciplinary approach, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You can't get a full picture by sticking to just one. A rich understanding emerges precisely from integrating these diverse perspectives, even when they seem to present tensions or complexities.
Let's revisit those complexities, the timeline issue.
Right, the likely difference between the Quranic Thamud timeframe and the peak of Nabatean Hegra. The probable explanation being that Thamud referred to different entities over time.
And the identification of Hegra itself.
Strong tradition links it to the Quranic story, but the archaeology is overwhelmingly Nabatean. Maybe the Quran refers to the region, or an older layer, or a shared tradition of rock carving. It remains a point of discussion.
Then there's the miracle versus science aspect.
Yes, recognizing that theological accounts of miracles operate in a different realm than scientific explanations of geological potential or natural processes. Science can provide context or plausibility for certain elements, but doesn't confirm or deny the divine interpretation.
And the identity of Thamud itself wasn't monolithic.
Exactly. Likely a fluid label encompassing diverse groups over a long period.
It really shows the strengths and limitations of each type of source, doesn't it?
Perfectly put. Religious texts offer theological meaning and moral frameworks. History gives us chronologies and political context from external viewpoints. Archaeology provides the physical evidence of past lives. Inscriptions are direct voices, however faint. Mythology shows universal human themes. Science explains the natural world. Each has its blind spots and its unique contributions.
And wrestling with the differences, the tensions, that's actually where deeper understanding comes from.
I think so. It forces us to think critically, to weigh evidence, to appreciate nuance, and to accept that the past is often complex and doesn't always fit neatly into simple boxes. A multidisciplinary approach embraces that complexity.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've really covered a lot of ground. The core Qur'anic narrative of Nabi Saleh and the Thamud's rise, arrogance, rejection of the sign, and destruction.
Then placing that within history, finding the Thamud mentioned by Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks, Romans over centuries in northwest Arabia.
We explored Hegra, Ma'dan Saleh, marveling at the Nabatean tombs, but noting the earlier traces and the complexities of linking it directly and solely to the Qur'anic Thamud.
We looked at how the story's motifs, the rejected messenger, the violated sign, the divine punishment resonate with myths and stories from cultures all around the world.
And we brought in the science, the geology of sandstone and earthquakes, the linguistics of Thamudic scripts, the environmental context of ancient Arabia.
It really underscores how the story, while deeply rooted in Arabian history and geography, carries these enduring theological messages about faith, hubris, justice, and mercy.
It's a powerful blend, isn't it? Religious narrative, historical fragments, archaeological wonders all coming together. It really makes you think about how we understand the past through these different lenses.
It does, and perhaps prompts us to consider other ancient stories or sites where faith, history, and science intersect, interact, and sometimes challenge each other.
Definitely leaves you with something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this exploration.
My pleasure. It's an endlessly fascinating subject.